On an ordinary day in 1941, the people of a small Russian town watched the river rise like a slow-moving executioner, not in a flash flood, not in a storm, but in a deliberate, planned, state-approved drowning, somewhere beneath the surface that would soon turn to open water. Streets and churches and graves were about to become an underwater city. And the decision had been made years earlier in Moscow, with Joseph Stalin's signature hovering over the map like a blade. To understand why Stalin would ever want a city underwater, you have to start with the Soviet Union's most dangerous obsession, not merely to rule territory but to remake it. In the Stalin era, nature was not scenery. Nature was a rival, an obstacle, a resource, and sometimes an enemy to be conquered in the same spirit as a political opponent. Rivers were not rivers, they were future kilowatts, navigable routes, and strategic moats. Forests were timber quotas, people were labor units, and entire towns, no matter their age, their churches, their cemeteries, could be reduced to a number on a planning document if that number stood in the way of the plan. The plan had a name long before most of the drowning began. In December 1920, in the ashes of the Civil War, Lenin endorsed Golro, the State Commission for the Electrification of Russia, an ambitious blueprint to electrify the country. The slogan, "Communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country," was not just propaganda. It was a worldview. Electricity would prove the revolution could deliver modern life and industrial might, and it would bind an enormous fractured land into a centralized system. When Stalin consolidated power in the late 1920s and launched the first five-year plan in 1928, electrification didn't fade into the background. It intensified, merging with forced collectivization, crash industrialization, and the violent mobilization of resources. The Soviet leadership wanted power stations the way empires once wanted fortresses. Hydroelectric dams were particularly seductive. They promised energy without imported fuel, and they seemed to transform geography into a machine. The Dnieper hydroelectric station, Dnipro-Hespegen, in 1927 and completed in 1932, became a symbol of Soviet modernity, a cathedral of concrete. It was photographed like a wonder of the world, but Dnipro-Hes also hinted at the true cost of Stalin's vision. Whole landscapes would be reordered, villages uprooted, labor squeezed from human bodies at brutal speed. It was a preview. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union was fixated on the Volga. The Volga River was not just Russia's great river, it was a spine. It linked regions and economies, and in Soviet strategic thinking, it could become a kind of inland highway system if engineered correctly. Stalin's government pushed a set of projects that historians later grouped under the idea of the Great Volga Transformation: dams, reservoirs, canals, and a new hydrological order that could feed industry, transport, and military logistics. And right at the center of this watery revolution was a project so vast it could swallow a town whole, the Rybinsk Reservoir. The Rybinsk hydroelectric complex was conceived in the 1930s as part of a cascade of hydroelectric and navigation works on the Volga and its tributaries. The reservoir that would form behind it was not a lake in the romantic sense, it was an engineered sea. At the time it was created, it was among the largest artificial lakes in the world by surface area, roughly 4,580 square kilometers when filled. A sheet of water so wide that the far shore could vanish into haze. Soviet posters and newspaper articles would later talk about the Rybinsk Sea as if it were an achievement so natural it had always been destined. But seas do not appear without taking something away. The area slated for flooding was not empty wilderness. It contained hundreds of settlements, forests, and at least one town with a name that would later become a quiet symbol of Soviet sacrifice: Mologa. Mologa was old. Long before Stalin, long before Lenin, long before Lenin, long before the Romanovs, the settlement existed as part of the medieval Russian world. It stood near where the Mologa River flows into the Volga, in what is now Yaroslavl Oblast. Like many river towns, it lived by water trade, fishing, agriculture, the rhythm of seasons. Its churches and houses were not monumental on an imperial scale, but they were real, lived in, textured. It had a market, schools, a cathedral, cemeteries where generations lay beneath the soil. It was not a mere point on a map to the people who lived there. It was their coordinates in the universe. Yet in the logic of Stalin's state, coordinates were redrawn by policy. What did Stalin actually want when he approved projects that would turn places like Mologa into submerged ruins? The blunt answer is power electrical, industrial, political and strategic. But to see why drowning a town could be justified, you have to step into the mindset of the 1930s Soviet leadership, living in fear and ambition at the same time. The Soviet Union in the early to mid-1930s was haunted by vulnerability. Stalin and his circle believed another major war was coming, and they were not wrong. Nazi Germany remilitarized, Japan expanded in Asia, and the European order cracked. The USSR's economy was still catching up to the industrial giants, and Stalin's rhetoric was explicit: lag behind, and you get crushed. In 1931, he delivered the now famous warning that Russia was 50 to 100 years behind advanced countries and must catch up in a decade or be smashed. Industrial capacity was survival. Electricity was industrial capacity. The Volga was a potential artery for moving raw materials, equipment, grain, and military supplies. And a huge reservoir could regulate river flows, improve navigation, and support a hydroelectric station feeding the grid. It also served another priority: Moscow itself. The Soviet capital was swelling in population and political importance, and it needed water, transport, and reliable supply lines. In 1937, Stalin presided over the opening of the Moscow-Volga Canal today, called the Moscow Canal, constructed with massive forced labor under NKVD administration. The canal connected Moscow to the Volga and was paired with the creation of the Ivankovo Reservoir, sometimes nicknamed the Moscow Sea. That reservoir inundated areas including the old town of Korcheva, which was largely relocated and submerged. The pattern was becoming clear. The new Soviet state would, quite literally, rearrange the map to feed its capital and its factories. These projects were never purely technical. They were political theater and political discipline. A hydroelectric dam was an announcement. The party commands nature. A reservoir was proof. The center can order the periphery to move. And if people resisted, the Soviet system had an institution built for converting resistance into compliance: the NKVD, with its prisons and camps and the ever-present accusation of sabotage. Construction of the Rybinsk complex relied on a mixture of free labor and forced labor, with the latter organized through the Gulag system. The Soviet forced labor camp network was not a side effect of Stalinism. It was a tool used for major infrastructure. Canal projects like the White Sea-Baltic Canal, completed in 1933, had already demonstrated how the regime could throw tens of thousands of prisoners into brutal conditions to achieve a propagandistic goal on an impossible schedule. The human cost was catastrophic, but the state learned a lesson. With enough coercion, the impossible could become merely expensive in lives. By the late 1930s, the machinery of repression was also peaking in the Great Terror of 1937 to 1938. This mattered because it changed how Soviet citizens experienced any state project. When the government told you to relocate because your village would be flooded, you were not negotiating with a democratic administration. You were receiving a command from a system that could arrest you, deport you, or worse. The fear was ambient. Even if the stated purpose was modernity, the method was intimidation. At first, the drowning of Mologa and its surroundings was not a single dramatic moment. It was an administrative process. Surveyors came, maps were drawn, meetings were held, notices were posted, People were told they would be moved, that compensation and new housing would follow, that sacrifice was required. The Soviet state had language for this. It spoke of resettlement and development and construction of socialism. In official narratives, those being relocated were participants in history, contributors to the bright future. In reality, relocation was wrenching. Families who had lived in the same place for generations faced the physical dismantling of their world. Houses were sometimes moved, log by log, to new sites. In other cases, buildings were demolished for salvage. Churches, already targets in the regime's campaign against religion, were not simply closed, many were destroyed or left to be swallowed. Cemeteries posed a particular horror. How do you relocate your dead? Some graves were moved, but countless burial sites were left behind. The earth would become silt, and memory would become rumor. And there was another layer of cruelty built into the project: the timeline. Reservoir filling does not happen slowly across centuries. It happens on state schedules. When the gates close and the water rises, it does not pause for mourning. The Rybinsk Reservoir began filling around 1941, but the lead-up spanned years, intersecting with some of the Soviet Union's darkest chapters. While plans advanced, the countryside was reeling from collectivization and famine earlier in the decade, and the political atmosphere was poisoned by denunciations and purges. People were already living with scarcity and fear. Then came the relocation orders. Then came the war. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, hurling millions of soldiers into Soviet territory. The Soviet Union lurched into a struggle that would kill tens of millions of its citizens. Everything became urgent: factories, weapons, logistics, energy. As German forces pushed east and Soviet industry was evacuated beyond the Urals, the demand for reliable power and transport routes became even more critical. In this context, the logic of completing hydro projects hardened into necessity. A reservoir was no longer just an emblem of socialist modernity. It was part of the wartime survival machine. And so the water kept rising. Imagine the sensory reality. Not a wave, not a storm, just the constant creeping expansion of the river into streets and fields. The soundscape changes. Wells become useless. The ground turns muddy. The air near the water grows damp, carrying the smell of rot from submerged vegetation. Wooden structures groan as they settle. The familiar boundaries of property lines vanish. A footpath to a neighbor's house becomes a shoreline. In winter, the flooded area freezes into an unnatural plain of ice, hiding what lies beneath like a lid on a coffin. For the Soviet state, this was progress. For the people watching their town die, it was erasure. Mologa is often called the underwater city because, unlike some villages that vanished with barely a trace, Mologa had the scale and identity of a town, and the reservoir was large enough to preserve the legend. When the water level is low, something that has happened at times, including during droughts, ruins and foundations can reappear. Witnesses have described seeing remnants of streets and brickwork rising out of the mud like bones. That physical reappearance fuels the haunting quality of the story. It feels like a city trying to breathe. But during the early 1940s, the drowning was final. The scale of displacement around the Rybinsk Reservoir was enormous. Estimates commonly cited in historical accounts put the number of relocated people in the broader reservoir zone in the hundreds of thousands, often around the 130,000 for the Rybinsk project, though exact figures vary depending on definitions and sources. What is not in dispute is that thousands of homes and many settlements were wiped off the map. And because the Soviet Union did not allow free press coverage of suffering caused by state projects, the human stories were largely locked away, living only in private grief, in letters, in family memories, and in the bureaucratic language of resettlement reports. There is a bitter irony here. Stalin's propaganda machines celebrated the conquest of nature, but the Soviet leadership also feared nature's unpredictability. Dams and reservoirs were supposed to tame seasonal floods and stabilize water flows. yet building them required an act of violence against the landscape that created new vulnerabilities: erosion along new shorelines, altered microclimates, flooding of forests that released decay into the water, changes in fish populations and local agriculture. The state promised control, but it also created a new kind of dependence of society, tied to the maintenance of vast structures whose failure could be catastrophic. Still, in the Stalin era, such doubts were not politically useful. The public narrative needed triumph. The dam and reservoir were presented as part of an inevitable march forward. Soviet newsreels loved the imagery: giant turbines, concrete poured in winter, workers framed against cranes, engineers in heavy coats pointing at blueprints. These images were meant to inspire a feeling that the USSR was building a future at industrial speed. And for many citizens, especially those who had grown up in the poverty of the late Tsarist countryside or endured the chaos of revolution and civil war, there was real awe in these projects. Electricity in a rural home, factories producing tractors and tanks, the promise of modernity. It was not all illusion, but the cost of that all was disproportionately paid by people like the residents of Mologa. Stalin's state had a particular way of turning local tragedy into national necessity. A village submerged was recast as a contribution to a hydroelectric station that would light cities and power factories. A church lost was reframed as a relic of superstition giving way to science. A family uprooted was celebrated as a resettled collective farm, joining modern agriculture. Individual pain was not merely ignored, it was ideologically repurposed. And yet, as the reservoir expanded, the contradictions sharpened. What does it mean for a state to claim it is building a workers' paradise while it erases a workers' town? What does it mean to glorify the people while treating them as movable objects? The Soviet system tried to resolve this contradiction by insisting that the state and the people were one. Therefore, any state action was, by definition, what the people wanted, whether the people agreed or not. In the case of Mologa, there were accounts that some residents resisted relocation, refusing to leave their homes. In the Soviet context, refusing a state order was not a civil disagreement. It could be interpreted as political hostility. People who clung to their houses were not just stubborn. They could be labeled as obstructing a state project, an accusation with frightening implications in the Stalin era. The atmosphere of the time ensured that many complied not because they believed in the project, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The tension in this story lies in the way two kinds of time collided. On one side was human time, generations, seasons, memory, the slow accumulation of meaning in a place. A town's identity is not only its buildings, it is weddings, funerals, harvests, gossip, the particular way light falls on a street at evening, the fact that everyone knows where the river ice breaks first in spring. This kind of time is not recorded in 5-year plans. On the other side was Stalinist time. Deadlines, quotas, targets, schedules, the relentless push to meet plan figures that were often politically set rather than technically realistic. Stalinist time demanded acceleration. It did not ask whether people were ready. It asked whether the state could afford to wait. In wartime, the answer was always no. As the early 1940s dragged on and the Soviet Union fought for survival, the reservoir became part of a desperate calculus. The war strained everything: railways, coal supply, industrial output, food distribution. Hydropower was one of the few sources of energy that, once built, could produce power without continuous fuel deliveries. And the reservoir's effect on navigation and water management offered logistical advantages. These were the kinds of benefits that planners could quantify, defend, and present to the leadership. But what about the benefits that could not be quantified? What about the cultural heritage erased? The psychological trauma of displacement? The quiet knowledge that the state could make your town vanish? Those costs were real, and they were long-term. They were simply not allowed to matter in the Stalinist equation. Now the story approaches its most dramatic moment. Because the climax of an underwater city is not the signing of the decree or the first shovel of earth. It is the day when the place finally ceases to exist above water. As the reservoir filled, buildings were abandoned. Some were dismantled. Others stood empty, waiting. In the imagination, you can picture a town becoming a shell, shutters hanging loose, doors banging in the wind, icons removed or left behind, furniture stripped or floating as the water creaks in. The Soviet Union was no stranger to abandoned places. War would soon leave thousands of villages burned and empty. But there is a special uncanny quality to abandonment by design. When the water finally covered Mologa, it did not just flood streets. It severed the relationship between people and place. You can relocate a household. You cannot relocate a hometown in the full sense. A new settlement might provide housing, but it cannot replicate the emotional geography of the old one. In Stalin's Soviet Union, where the state tried to monopolize meaning, such attachments could even be viewed as politically suspicious, too local, too personal, too resistant to the grand narrative. And yet, even the Soviet state could not entirely control what people remembered. After the war, the USSR emerged victorious but shattered. Stalin tightened his grip, and the post-war years saw reconstruction, renewed ideological campaigns, and further mega-projects. The Volga continued to be engineered. Massive dams would rise in the following decades, including projects like the Kubyshev-Samara Reservoir and others that submerged additional settlements. The logic of hydroelectric conquest did not end with Stalin's death in 1953, but Stalin's era set the tone. Human landscapes were expendable if they served the industrial state. The Rybinsk Reservoir remained a permanent inland sea. Ships crossed it, ice formed on it, people fished it, children grew up near it with no living memory of the town beneath. The underwater city became a ghost story, but also a suppressed history. Then something happened that authoritarian systems often fear more than sabotage. Time passed, and the political climate changed. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech in February 1956 condemned Stalin's cult of personality and some of his crimes. The Soviet Union did not become a free society, but the ideological temperature shifted. Some hidden stories began to surface, slowly. Later still, in the era of glasnost under Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 1980s, discussion of Soviet-era tragedies expanded dramatically. Topics once buried: purges, famines, Gulag, labor entered public conversation. In that atmosphere, the story of submerged towns like Mologa gained new resonance. It fit a broader pattern: the Soviet state's appetite for grand achievements, and its readiness to consume human lives and local worlds to feed that appetite. And Mologa had an advantage as a symbol. It wasn't only a statistic in a famine ledger or a number in a Gulag report. It had a physical location. It had, in a sense, a grave visible only when the water receded. In some years, low water levels have reportedly revealed remnants of the old town site foundations, bricks, fragments. There have been commemorations and memorial efforts. The submerged city became a focus for descendants and historians who wanted to restore something Stalinism tried to remove: the legitimacy of private grief and local memory. But if the story ended there, it would be too simple: villain, victim, revelation. The harder truth is that Stalin's drive to build an underwater city was not motivated by a desire to drown towns for its own sake. It was driven by the cold logic of industrial and strategic power, a logic shared though rarely taken to such extremes by many modernizing states in the 20th century. Dams around the world displaced communities. Reservoirs swallowed valleys. The difference in Stalin's USSR was the combination of scale, coercion, and ideological absolutism. In a system with no independent courts, no free press, and a security apparatus that could criminalize complaint, there was no effective break. So why did Stalin want it? Because a reservoir could do several things at once: And Stalin's regime prized multi-purpose instruments of control. It could generate electricity, feeding factories that produced steel, tanks, aircraft parts, and machinery. It could improve navigation, allowing barges to move bulk goods more efficiently across immense distances, reducing strain on railways that were often overburdened. It could regulate water supply for cities and industries. It could be defended as necessary for the war effort and later for post-war reconstruction. And it could be wrapped in a story of triumph over nature, making the state's violence look like progress. But there is another, darker reason that sits beneath the technical rationales. Stalin's system was built on demonstrating that nothing, no institution, no tradition, no landscape, no community was outside the state's reach. The ability to flood a town was the ability to prove total power. It was not enough to govern people. The regime wanted to govern the conditions of their existence. When you can order a city to vanish underwater, you send a message that the center is sovereign, not only over law and labor, but over memory and geography. And that message mattered in the 1930s and 1940s because Stalin's authority was both immense and insecure. He had eliminated rivals, but the fear of threats, real or imagined, never stopped. Megaprojects served as both practical infrastructure and political validation. They displayed competence. They generated heroic narratives. They mobilized society. They created dependencies. A dam makes regions dependent on the central plan. It ties local life to national grids and schedules. It becomes a physical manifestation of the state. The climax of this story, then, is not only the moment water closed over Mologa. It is the moment when Stalin's modern state proved it could replace an ancient human settlement with an engineered sea and call it victory. Yet history has a way of mocking the certainty of planners. The Soviet Union did become a superpower. It did electrify vast territories. It did win the war against Nazi Germany at a staggering cost. It did build a hydroelectric network that powered cities and industries. In that sense, the state achieved some of what it promised. But it also created a legacy of displacement and environmental transformation that could not be contained by propaganda. Reservoirs altered ecosystems and local climates. Forced labor left scars in family histories. The habit of treating communities as expendable units contributed to a broader culture of cynicism and alienation. People learned that the state's bright future might require the destruction of their present. And when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, it was not undone by a single dam or a single reservoir, of course. It fell from economic stagnation, political crisis, nationalist movements, and the failure of legitimacy. But legitimacy is built from stories people tell about their past. The more that suppressed histories surfaced purges, famines, deportations, disasters, the harder it became to sustain the old heroic narrative. In that post-Soviet landscape, places like Mologa took on a new meaning. They were no longer just casualties of progress. They became evidence of how progress had been defined, who got to decide, who paid the price, who was allowed to mourn. And it is here, in the aftermath, that the underwater city becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a mirror, because the question is not only why Stalin wanted to build a city underwater. The question is, what kind of state, what kind of ideology, what kind of moral logic makes that seem acceptable? What has to happen in a society for the drowning of a town to be framed as a triumph? Part of the answer is fear. Fear of invasion, fear of backwardness, fear of losing power. Stalin's USSR was born in chaos and expected enemies everywhere, and those expectations shaped a paranoid, militarized modernization. Another part is ambition. The Soviet project was not content with incremental improvement. It promised transformation, and transformation, pursued without restraint, often turns violent. But the most unsettling part of the answer is that the underwater city is not only about Stalin, it's about the temptation, present in many eras, to treat human landscapes as raw material. To see a community and think first of what lies beneath it. coal, water, strategic position, transportation rather than the life there. Stalinism did not invent that temptation, but it weaponized it with a ruthless administrative machine. Today, when satellites can map the world in high resolution and governments can relocate populations for megaprojects, when climate change forces discussions of managed retreat and submerged coastlines, the story of Mologa feels uncomfortably modern. Not because today's world is Stalin's world. It is not, but because the underlying tension remains, the clash between grand plans and lived places, between the logic of systems and the value of roots. Somewhere beneath the surface of the Rybinsk reservoir, the outline of a town still exists in fragments, foundations, stones, the geometry of streets broken by silt. It is silent, but it is not nothing. It is a reminder that history is not only built upward in monuments, sometimes it is built downward, buried under water, kept out of sight, so the surface can look smooth. And that may be the final irony Stalin never fully controlled. He could flood a city. He could erase it from maps. He could force people to move and forbid them to speak openly of the loss. But he could not make the place stop meaning something, because an underwater city is still a city in the human mind in absence that keeps its shape. When the wind blows across the reservoir and the water darkens under a low sky, it is easy to imagine the old riverbanks underneath, the old roads leading nowhere, the lost town held in cold suspension. The Soviet state wanted a sea that would power the future. It got that sea, but it also created a ghost that outlived it, a submerged testament to what happens when a government decides that progress is measured only in megawatts and tonnage, and not in the fragile, stubborn fact that people belong to places. That is why Stalin wanted to build a city underwater, not because he loved drowning towns, but because his system loved the kind of power that made drowning a town possible, and then called the silence afterward a victory.